My name is Mateusz Mazzini, and we're broadcasting directly from Impact CE 2025 in Poznań for TVP World Talks. My guest now is Ivan Krastev, renowned political scientist and chairman for Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. Ivan, welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Ivan, I wanted to talk to you about democracy, but since my university days, I've learned to start with definitions. And one of my favorite, perhaps even the best, working definitions of democracy is that of Professor Adam Przeworski, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah.
He wrote years ago that democracy is a system of governance in which parties lose elections. So in other words, it has to be even remotely possible for whoever is in power to lose or win the upcoming elections. But right now in Europe, we're faced with a choice of allowing for that rotation or banning certain political formations like the AfD or other formations in other parts of the continent that might not comply to democratic standards as we know it. Is the rotation in democratic governance in Europe still possible or under threat?
Listen, the biggest problem of democracy is that you have two preconditions for democracy to work. If the stakes are too low, if you change the government and nothing change, democracy cannot work because people does not have a reason to vote. But if basically the stakes are very high, and if you're losing the elections, you're losing everything, it's also very difficult for the democracy to function, because if somebody believes that these elections are the last elections, obviously they're not going to allow to lose them. I don't believe in banning political parties, particularly when political parties go above 20-25% of the vote. One of the kind of trick of democracy is that you are making radical parties in order to increase their support to move to the center. And this is how different radical parties have been socialized. The problem is what is happening if suddenly you have such a high level of polarization that you don't trust that the other party is going to follow the rules of the game. And here, listen, we don't know. We're never going to know what was the best policy unless if we're going to see it from 30 years and looking back. But still, I don't believe that, particularly in the case of Germany now, with 25% of the voters voting for AfD, banning it, you're simply going to make heroes out of it. And listen, if people want to vote, protest, and if they go for radical change, you're not going to stop them if they're going to be a functioning, competitive electoral system.
Absolutely. But I'm going to press you on that particular case a little bit, perhaps playing the devil's advocate here, because on the one hand, I think we all agree that banning AfD in Germany will probably provide the risk of them even going further in the polls, making heroes out of themselves, and actually fueling the anti-establishment narrative. But I can easily imagine the native electorate of the current government, people that vote CDU, CSU, even SPD, actually being in favor and demanding Friedrich Merz to do that. So on the one hand, you can't really ban them. On the other hand, you run the risk of antagonizing your own electorate. Is there a good solution out of this?
No, listen, we're in a moment in which there's not need to be a good solution. And what is one of the important things that we are facing is that people are unhappy, they're angry, they have the feeling that the system does not work in the way it works. And because we have a long years, particularly in Western Europe, for a kind of a very peaceful and stable political environments, people are ready to take much higher risks. And even the existence of the European Union, paradoxically, is becoming one more safety net in which you say, I want to show how unhappy I am. I'm going to vote for them exactly because others believe that I should not do this. But when these parties came to power, by the way, they don't know how they're going to behave. And this is the story. In many cases, we're talking about the protest movements, which does not have this kind of a classical party structure or ideology. They're much more opportunistic and trying to mobilize the anger of the voters. So anybody who is going to tell you that they know what AfD is going to do, if they're going to be part of a government or if they're going to win the elections, is lying. But on the other side, because we don't know, we say we're not going to allow for them to run, is going to put, in my view, the system in a crisis of legitimacy, which is very difficult to overcome.
So what should be the role of the European Union in all this? Because we know that European Union has some mechanisms to safeguard parts of the democratic process, rule of law protection, for instance. But the Romanian case, I believe, is particularly interesting because on the one hand, we had numerous declarations on behalf of Brussels officials that obviously the European Union does not interfere in domestic elections. It's a unique competence of nation states. But on the other hand, the European Commission went along with the annulation of the first round of the presidential ballot last November in Romania.
Yeah, listen, this is a big issue. There was a decision of Constitutional Court. So you should imagine that the European Union is going to respect it because this was the decision of a very independent body. On the other side, I do believe it was a totally wrong decision. And the story was that you have a grand coalition government and their candidate didn't manage to go to the second round. Obviously, something was going wrong. And obviously, in the moment like this, to try to annul the first round of the elections, to stop a candidate running, you're deepening the crisis, you're not solving the crisis. And this is the story of European Union. You cannot believe that you can be simply legal and technical, because in a moment of a major polarization, the legal is political. And I don't know what is, I do believe that up to them was to say, we don't know, but we are really kind of worried about the fact that we have an elections that have been challenged. Was this going to change the political dynamics in Romania? I don't believe it. And I do believe we're in a moment in which politics is very local. People try to believe that what EU is going to say, what the United States is going to say, is going to solve elections here and there. At the end of the day, when people vote, they vote very much looking at their national context, trying to understand.
Or even more local.
Yeah, from this
next door
point
neighbors, communities.
to be honest, it's very important. Even if you talk about the Trump effect, normally people are going to say, yes, he very much kind of strengthened the nationalistic moment. But the nationalistic moment has two different manifestation. One is strengthening the position of the far right. The other is this anti-Trump nationalism that you have in places like Canada or Australia, where political parties that basically everybody believed are going to lose the elections big, suddenly get re-elected exactly because of the Trump moment. So the story is that you don't know how the Trump effect is going to affect the national politics in different countries. Listen, I have a favorite joke, which for me was my methodological Bible. There were three boys, German, French, and Swiss, discussing where the babies come from. And the German boy said, they come from the skies. And the French boy said, it's ridiculous, they come from the bedroom. But then the Swiss boy became very much nervous and said, do not generalize. It's different from canton to canton. Probably it's
That's
not true about
Swiss
babies.
Answer. Yeah.
But I do believe it's true for the political situation here. You don't know how decision that works in one way in one country, how the same decision can have a totally different impact in the other country.
Is this what you think we're seeing so much divergence in the reaction to Trump among Europe and non-European countries? We have obviously Canada, Australia, so center-left parties doomed to fail in elections, but then suddenly bumping back.
Totally.
And then in Europe, the opposite seems to be the case, that the far right is actually being fueled by the return of Trump to power. Is this the reason that we see so much divergence?
Listen, you have this. Of course, Trump came in an environment which already have been kind of polarized and basically voters are looking in different directions. If you look the opinion polls on the German elections, before Vance's speech in Munich and after Vance's speech in which American Vice President supported openly AfD, you're going to see that AfD didn't gain and CDU didn't lose. The only kind of a big change from the electoral polling to the electoral results was the left party. Which was normally was not going to make it in the parliament and suddenly ended up with a 9%. So the story of entering the other people's politics is that you never know how it's going to work. And yes, Romania in a major way was very different. You have basically a political debate where the message coming from the United States was perceived and heard by the people as encouraging voting for the far right. I don't know what is going to be the impact if the United States is going to interfere in the Polish politics. But in places like Canada and Australia, this is fair to say that basically the Trump effect worked against the interests of the United States.
So let's talk about the abstract principles a little bit, and perhaps even contradict the Swiss boys' perception from your joke. Two other political scientists I'm sure you're familiar with, Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky, write a lot about competitive authoritarianism, which in short could be summarized as a system of governance in which democratic institutions sort of remain in place, but democratic substance is eroding.
Yeah.
We can see certainly that being true in the United States, but do you think this is also becoming apparent in Europe?
Listen, I see democracy changing in general for many reasons. One, its information space is changing dramatically. We see basically the national consensuses being destroyed. People are living in a much more fragmented societies. The government, by the way, lost the control over the information space, regardless of who is the government. Political parties are much weaker. The very fact that you have so many new players entering at a low cost. But one of their major arguments, which I find extremely convincing, is to understand, is a society still a democracy? The most important is to understand how high is the cost of being in opposition. The major difference between democracies and this competitive authoritarian regime is that you don't really want to be an opposition in a competitive authoritarian regimes. The price that you're paying is very high.
And you're also not an effective opposition.
You're not an effective opposition because in a certain way all the institutions are tilted against you. And as if there are elections, but there are elections in which the chances to win are very low because there are going to be administrative resources, because they could be rigging of the elections. So from this point of view, this is, in order to understand, is a country of democracy, there are two actors to ask, media and opposition.
So let's talk about media and opposition all in one and the future of democracy in Europe. Do you feel like it is still possible for any state, any public sector actor to regain control over the information space and actually regain information sovereignty put with the hands of the administration? Or shall we forget about liberal democracies from the 20th century as we knew it and hope for something new?
They're going to be something new. But listen, democracy has been changing incredibly. We always we behaved as if the liberal democracy and the way it existed in Western Europe in 70s and 80s was what democracy always was. It was not. It's going to change. And by the way, talking about fragmentation, tomorrow anybody will be able to directly influence Polish voters because through the Google Translate, everybody could speak Polish. Everybody basically can send messages in Poland. Before, some of the small states were very much protected by their languages. It was not easy to
also
interfere in the
artificial intelligence is going to make it
Artificial intelligence is
exponentially
going
easier.
to make it there. So we should try to understand, for me, much more important question is first, how we are going to rethink the meaning of freedom. Because democracy is simply a political regime that secures the freedom of the individuals, the rights of the individuals. Democracy is important because of freedom. What it means to be a free person today, in information space, in economic terms, in everything else, we should ask this question, and probably the answers and the institutions are going to be different than the one that we know. We should not be afraid of change. I always believe that when society starts to fear change, when society starts fearing future, this is already a signal that something is wrong. Learning to date the future again, in my view, is the best that can happen to our societies.
But will that change come from the public or the private sector institutions? Because I think that's a great divide that separates a lot of political actors today.
Listen, one of the things that, to be honest, strikes me is normally we're going to talk about authoritarianism in China, democracy in the United States, and then you see in China where the government basically nationalized the big technological companies. In America, you're seeing slightly the big technological companies privatizing the state. We have this merging the state. So you have these convergences that really worries me more than anything else, because it is not that authoritarianisms are up and democracies are down. The problem is that the border between democracy and authoritarianism is the least protected border in the world.
Hopefully, we will develop effective solutions to protect that border. Ivan Krastev, political scientist, chairman, Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, was our guest at TVP World. Thank you very much.
Thank you.